So there's a lot of sword terminology out there, and it comes from a bunch of different cultures, and it means different things, and some of it means the same thing, and it gets confusing, and there's a lot of inaccuracies as we find out more about swords. But we're going to focus on a couple of small things today, mostly from the European culture, because that's what I know most about. So this sword is a long sword. But where does that name come from? So we don't really know exactly what this thing would have been called back in the day. It probably would have been called sword.
In whatever language.
Yeah, in whatever language that would have been. It might have been called long sword to differentiate it from a shorter sword. One thing it was not called, and I hear this a lot, is broad sword.
Yeah.
And the reason that kind of gets to me is because all swords at the time were broad-bladed. In the European culture, there weren't any thin-bladed swords like a rapier or like a small sword, which is a thrusting-only sword. At that time, to my knowledge, can you think of any?
No, I mean, within Europe, no. Pretty much anything you saw in Europe would have been this or a single-handed shorter version, but basically the same setup, maybe with a disc pommel, but like the same thing.
The single-handed shorter sword would have either been called maybe a short sword, probably an arming sword.
Probably just sword.
Probably just sword,
I mean,
honestly.
I sometimes wonder how often your average person even needed to talk about swords.
Swords were
They
expensive.
probably just saw it and thought it's a sword.
Not everybody could afford a sword. They were pretty expensive, and so the average person probably would never get their hands on a sword. And so they'd say, that man, he got him a sword.
Yeah.
Except, probably in
What kind of
sword? It's like, I don't know. It was long.
Yeah.
So long sword. We talk about German long sword because there's a specific tradition of swordsmanship that comes out of Germany at a specific time, and at that specific time, this was the weapon they were using for that style of sword fighting. But like the rapier is one of the first European swords to become thinner. The rapier or the side sword.
Right.
Research is kind of fuzzy on that. We don't know. I mean, personally, I don't know. I'm sure somebody knows. The rapier and the side sword, which came first, and whatever, but they're basically roughly in around the same time, somewhere in the mid to late 1500s.
Yeah. Rapier's probably a little later,
yeah.
but it's hard to say. It looks like maybe the side sword and the rapier might have developed alongside
each other. I'm sorry. And then we get confusing because centuries and
centuries and years.
So like we know that they were rapiers in the 1600s. That was kind of the 1600s into the 1700s. Mostly 1600s rapiers were a thing. Early rapiers in the 1500s were happening. Mm-hmm. I don't think there were any rapiers in the 1400s.
I don't know. I mean, that's the other thing is people. I don't think people were writing really elaborate inventories of weapons at the time. We just kind of have to piece it together from examples.
The heyday of the longsword. So the longsword, the first thing that we can really call a longsword started to come out in around about 1100. And then from there, it kind of was in use with its big heyday of all of these longsword techniques and stuff happening in the 1400s. I think that's when a lot of these German books were written. But again, there probably was stuff before that. How much could they?
Fiore was, I think, 1420 or so.
Yeah, and then Talhofer, I think, was 1400s
right.
as well.
So right around.
But then again, like how much writing was happening before that? Fecht books or fight books weren't really.
And
the treatises from before that weren't as common.
Well, and those treatises were not used to like
train armies. No,
those were for like noblemen who wanted to learn to be the best with it, and
Yeah, and that's another misconception.
Not to disparage those treatises, but
that's another misconception about the books, about these fencing treatises that a lot of us get our information from. They were not what the average person was learning, because the average person, first off, didn't have access, probably couldn't read. The average person, even soldiers, even some higher up soldiers, probably couldn't read.
Maybe they didn't even have their own sword. Maybe.
Probably no.
Probably not.
Definitely did not have access to a book, because books they had to be hand printed. When did the printing press come in?
God, I forget when the printing press was. Gutenberg
Yeah,
made it.
I don't know.
It was after the medieval period.
Yeah, so
late medieval.
maybe treatises were being done on printing presses then, but still they were not getting. There were woodcuts. I remember that there were some woodcuts. So, but those treatises were not like, oh yes, you're a soldier, come and study this. It was like,
Right.
and
They weren't on the shelf at a bookstore.
And there
if
were-
they even existed.
there were fencing schools,
Yeah.
mostly noblemen who had the time to do it. It wasn't like the average soldier, and so a lot of the stuff we see in these German fencing manuals and stuff like that wasn't necessarily the technique that was happening out on the battlefield or in the streets. It's a lot fancier, and those moves definitely work, but a lot of the core techniques you can find amongst, like, you can Italian and German and English fencing all have a very similar parry structure, very similar attack and defense, because that's the kind of stuff that just worked. It's what the
Right.
normal people would have
Well,
learned.
you've got human beings with the same joints and muscles,
stuff like that.
You've got weapons that are basically the same thing. Only so many optimal ways to use it,
Yeah.
and they just
So,
develop.
so this is we kind of got off topic. This long sword, it probably would have just been called a sword.
Right.
And this gets to me all the time. Broadsword to me is like when someone says katana sword, which I'm
Yeah.
sure you guys are cringing, because at the time that the
Hey,
katana,
katana sword.
at the time the katana was in circulation, when you said, I mean, I don't know, I'm not the Japanese scholar over here. I don't know everything about it, but that was the sword.
Katana.
You would say that, and like if you said sword, it was probably assumed you were talking about a katana.
Also very rare in that culture too.
Yes,
Probably
and
even
so
more so.
like an average person who uses the word sword wasn't talking about one of those different ones. Like I know there's like the naginata and there's other stuff.
Tachi.
Yeah, there's other stuff, but when they said sword, the average person, they weren't being like, oh, that specific one. They're like, oh yeah, the sword, the one that the nobles use.
You know, it's like today, people don't necessarily even know a lot of weird specifics about guns that say the guy has a rifle, the guy has a pistol.
Yeah,
whatever,
it's like,
a gun.
some people who are into guns
Sure.
know a lot about guns.
Right.
The average person who's not into guns, you either have a long gun or a rifle, or you have a handgun or a pistol.
Yeah.
It doesn't go much
Or
beyond that.
shotgun
Or you
or
might
whatever.
say like assault rifle, which is a huge term that's
Yeah,
all
I
nebulous
don't
and whatever.
wanna-
But we're not getting into guns because that's not what the channel's about.
No.
So, but then, so we're talking about like short swords, right? So the short sword came in a bunch of different varieties, but the arming sword, the kind of thing that you have on your side as a secondary weapon from a spear or something else, that probably would also just be called sword. And at the time of the rapier, probably just called
I don't know.
A
Maybe
sword.
just sword.
maybe because no, I mean Shakespeare uses the word rapier, doesn't he?
I can't remember.
I think he does. But he also just uses the word sword. But this is where it comes from, right? Cultures that came after the use of this had to differentiate it from what they were using now. So that's where this idea of a broadsword comes in. Because now there's something to differentiate a broad-bladed sword from a thin-bladed sword. So at the time of the rapier, you might have heard the term broadsword, because the rapier is a thin-bladed sword. If you say sword, maybe you're assuming you're thinking of rapier,
Right.
but you're like, no, I meant broadsword.
Or like a Scottish
Yeah,
basket hilt sword.
Basket
Maybe
hilt
they would have
sword.
called that some kind of
I think it's actually called a
broadsword or
claymore.
back
I
sword.
think that's like the actual.
Yeah,
correct-
claymore comes from a Gaelic word, I think, that
There's-
just means big knife. Vladimir, I think.
I'm not. Well, then there's Messer, which literally just means knife, which is great.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the word Messer in German just means knife.
It's built like a knife.
It is built like a knife.
Yeah.
And there's a whole thing about like why it was named that. Some people think it was to get around some sort of sword-carrying band, but I've seen evidence that shows that's a myth. There's a couple of cool people on YouTube have done good stuff on that, so I'm not going to redo it again.
Sure. Yeah.
But then you get into other cultures, right? So then you've got this. It is called an espada, which means
Plastic sword?
no, espada.
Sword.
It means sword
In Spanish.
It means sword in Spanish. And
But
so
it's not from Spain. It was
no, this is from the
Filipino,
This is a Filipino espada.
But the Spanish were there.
Spanish were there colonized at bad time.
Not good.
So, but yes, again, this just is sword. It just means, now we say espada, which differentiates it from this sword.
But that's us.
But that's us,
Yeah.
nowadays. Back in the day, they
Because we're
said,
sitting here after all this history,
Yes.
looking at it all.
Looking
and being
at
like,
it-
What do we call that? What do we call
exactly.
that? What do we call
And
that?
that brings into stuff like the oak shot type classification. Oak shot type classification is great because
Something
it,
I still don't really understand.
yeah, I don't
even
really-
have the book, but
Yeah,
I can't tell you if something's a 12.
oh no, I can't cite things off. But yeah, he classified all these different swords. Now oak shot
Based
himself
on like profile.
wasn't a swordsman.
No, he
didn't know how they were used, but it was cool to be like, okay, these are the different swords.
I'm sure he knew that you use them like this to some extent.
Or like this.
Or like this.
So yeah, these sword names we get nowadays.
Bastard sword.
That's another one, bastard. You were telling me something about bastard sword. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it might have been Scala Gladiatoria.
Matt Easton, yeah.
Matt Easton.
Well, same thing.
Yeah. Well, that's the name of his channel. But
Yeah, you're right.
anyway, I think he has talked quite a bit about how bastard sword is a modern term. I think maybe from the 1800s or something, that people came up with to describe these things that are basically long swords, but
A little shorter.
a little bit shorter hilt, a little bit shorter blade, and a little bit wider. And I don't know where the name comes from, but it was certainly not something they would use at the time.
There wasn't like, if you have a gun, it's mass produced, so you have like this type. There wasn't that for swords. They were mostly
That just reminded me of something.
mostly hand forged. So they didn't look the same. This is a mass produced longsword, so it kind of looks the same. There's a bunch of different brands and a bunch of different types. The same way back in the day, a blacksmith probably didn't make the exact same sword over and over again. They probably had, my longsword go like this. The next person's longsword might have a shorter hilt to here, and the blade might only be down to here, but it's still a longsword. It's just a sword. And they'd be made for the person. So if I'm a nobleman, I have the money to buy a sword, I'm going to come and see, I need a sword made for me. And they're going to take measurements, they're going to figure out what I want.
Talk to you about what you want.
It's going to look different than Matt's sword. Matt's sword's going to be longer than my sword, probably.
Probably.
Unless I'm like, no, I want a very long sword because I'm a very short
I
person.
think generally speaking,
Something
having
about-
this somewhere near your
I
head
think
is good.
something about, I think I said something about in Fiore, something about, or maybe it was Lichtenauer, I can't remember which one,
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
sword of the armpit, something like that. So,
Sure.
not yours. Well, maybe not, maybe it's not, because I know that I'm short.
Well, no, but that would just mean if I were going to order one that I knew I had to fight with, I would want it to be like the perfect size for me.
Yeah, and then, so I think that a lot of the terminology that we use nowadays in the colloquial language we have is from later generations trying to go back and classify different types of swords nowadays. In the day, at the time it was being used, this was a sword.
Mm-hmm.
A shorter one would have been a sword.
And again, we're mostly just talking about Europe here.
Europe.
Because I'm already thinking in my head, like, even during this time period, there were other...
Oh,
the Middle
absolutely.
East had different kinds of
Different
swords
kinds
that
of
they had
swords.
different names for.
And
but
again,
I don't know a lot about it.
my experience and my knowledge is mostly centered around European swords. So that is all I am talking about today. I'm not making claims for other cultures, though I do think that this same thing probably applied. I'm pretty sure that in other cultures, the average person, a sword is hard to make.
Well,
the average person probably couldn't afford one.
Right.
And so it was a unique item. There were different types, definitely, for each civilization, but there was probably a main one for a certain type in use at any given time, which would mean that you just call that one a sword.
Yes. What I thought about a second ago is swords. I don't know if I could call this like a resurgence of swords, but in the 1800s, right up through World War I, the militaries used swords.
Yes, sabers and all kinds
And
of stuff.
they were mass produced and
You're right.
pretty good, and they had very specific names. They would literally call them like a M1883 light cavalry saber,
So with mass production.
So back then there might have been, but that's again very specific terminology. If you're not a soldier, you probably just would call it a sword or maybe a saber.
Because now, saber, because it's rattling your sabers.
Right,
and they're probably amongst the military were different names for like if it had a curve or whatever. But I don't think that they got really hung up on is that the German longsword or is that the Italian longsword?
We're not talking about like medieval Europe anymore.
No.
We're basically talking about the modern age.
Yeah, the modern age. And then you got this is funny because a lot of people think that the things like the claymore and the montante sword and the Zweihander are these
big
ancient
old
swords. They're very modern.
Yeah.
They're actually from the 1700s. Around that time, 17, maybe even 8.
Well, I think what happened was that they got so good at metallurgy
That they could
and
make
the skill of the craftsmen and people. There were a lot of people in different societies who had a lot of money. You had merchants and nobles who wanted bodyguards.
Yeah.
And so those bodyguards,
And
they would
big.
equip their bodyguards with this sword that's like as
Yeah.
big as they are. Also, surprisingly easy to maneuver.
Yeah, if you can do
About
it.
6 or 7 pounds for a huge sword.
Yeah, 8 on the top end, but yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes from this rotational, and we talked about how spins don't, the kind of spins that, you know,
Body
where
spins.
body spins.
No.
But there are situations where they'll do body spins where they'll pivot and spin using the momentum of the sword.
Sure.
But that's different, and that's a different video.
That's for possibly fending off multiple people.
Yeah, and then you
maybe
enter,
you have armor.
and now you're entering this whole other thing because now we got great swords. What's a great sword? Is it a spadona?
I think that's what it is.
Yeah, or is
Just
it
another word.
a montante sword, or is it a Zweihander, or is it a claymore?
I
It's the
think
same thing in each different culture. Of course, it looks different, but this is the thing we're doing later on. You're just using the culture's name for that sword. Zweihander, two-hander. You're using that name to classify it when it is just a great sword.
And I think spadona, I don't speak Italian,
I don't
but it's
either.
similar to Spanish in that the ona part might mean big.
Oh,
Spada, spadona.
and then claymore is in Gaelic, and I have
Yeah, I think the original word was Vladimir.
There's two different ones.
Or maybe it was Welsh, actually.
Well,
I think
you
it was
might be right.
Welsh.
You might be
I
right.
can't
But
remember
I remember there's two different ones that get confused a lot. One, the way we use claymore for the two-handed sword is
Well,
actually kind of a misnomer. Because
Gladius.
Yeah.
That's what the glad and gladius is.
Interesting.
It's from glad, which I
Wow.
think they copied that design from the Celts.
We're getting a little off topic.
Sorry.
But yes, no, I mean, you're right. Exactly. It's this bottomless well of terminology. So be kind on the internet because everyone's right about the things they're calling swords, and everybody's also wrong about the things they're telling each other about swords. Because
Yeah.
there's no hard and fast rules.
That sounds good.
Yeah, everyone's right and everyone's wrong. So if you liked this video,
Hit it with a bastard sword.
incorrectly name the like button something.
Yeah.
Now it's
The thumbs up
the
button.
thumbs up button. Thank you. And what should you do for the subscribe button? What should we call that?
I don't know. I got nothing.
The
Just call it a button.
the button.
Just the button.
Yeah, just hit the buttons.
Yeah, just hit the button.
Hit the buttons.
It's a contemporary.
Get out of here.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this or any of our other content, please consider supporting us on Patreon or YouTube memberships. Your support allows us to continue making this content and to upgrade our weapons and gear so we can keep bringing you fresh, new silliness.